John Wilkes Booth was a celebrated actor and Southern sympathizer who became one of history's most infamous assassins. John Wilkes Booth, the man who murdered President Abraham Lincoln, was born near Bel Air, Maryland on May 10, 1838. He came from America's most famous theatrical family. He had a striking appearance and magnetic stage presence. Booth's talent for performance was evident from childhood. He was educated at private academies until his teenage years, when the lure of the stage became irresistible. Then in 1855, his father died and the 17-year-old Booth began pursuing acting professionally, starting with small roles in Baltimore and Philadelphia theaters. John Wilkes Booth was a man of the South who owned no slaves himself but believed deeply in the Confederate cause. In 1858, when tensions between North and South were reaching a breaking point, Booth, now a rising star on the American stage, was performing in theaters across the country. Booth acted in Shakespearean plays throughout the late 1850s. When he was a young performer, he captivated audiences in cities from Richmond to Chicago. He became one of the highest-paid actors in America, and after achieving stardom, he was known for his passionate performances and his dark good looks. He was celebrated for his roles as villains and tragic heroes in the plays of Shakespeare. In 1859, Booth witnessed the execution of abolitionist John Brown in Virginia. Within months, he had joined a secret pro-Southern militia group and was becoming increasingly political in his views. Booth was not an intellectual like his brother Edwin or a moderate voice seeking compromise. He was a fervent extremist, if you will, who saw the conflict in absolute terms of Southern honor and Northern aggression. In early 1861, Booth was performing to sold-out crowds when the Civil War began. 1 month later, Fort Sumter fell to Confederate forces. Booth was literally the man on stage who used his celebrity status to move freely between North and South while secretly supporting the rebellion. In 1862, Booth's acting career reached its peak with performances in major cities including New York and Boston. The audiences loved him and critics praised his intensity, but within his heart Booth was consumed with rage over the war. John Wilkes Booth never enlisted in the Confederate Army, but he never stopped supporting their cause. He always found ways to aid the South from behind the lines. On November 9, 1863, Booth attended a performance at Ford's Theater in Washington where President Lincoln was present in the audience. Booth was using his access to theaters and his fame to plan something terrible, and no one suspected what he was contemplating. Booth began plotting to kidnap President Lincoln, but following the collapse of those schemes was a turn toward something far darker for the troubled actor. The fall of Richmond in April 1865 was the breaking point. That devastating defeat pushed Booth beyond kidnapping toward murder. Booth's strategy was all about striking a blow for the dying Confederacy. Booth recruited co-conspirators for what would become the last major crime of the Civil War. In April 1865, with Lee's surrender at Appomattox, Booth learned that Lincoln would attend a performance at Ford's Theater on April 14. On Good Friday, April 14, 1865, John Wilkes Booth entered Ford's Theater in Washington carrying a pistol and a knife. Booth was the only assassin who successfully completed his mission that night as part of a larger conspiracy. Booth led himself into the presidential box during a performance of Our American Cousin. He knew the theater intimately from his years on stage, and he used that knowledge to approach the president unseen. On that terrible night, Booth shot Abraham Lincoln in the back of the head. Lincoln never regained consciousness and died the following morning at 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865. Booth leaped from the presidential box to the stage below, breaking his leg in the fall, and shouted in Latin before escaping into the night. The nation was plunged into grief and shock. Washington was thrown into chaos as the manhunt began immediately. Booth fled on horseback into Maryland with his accomplice David Herold. For 12 days Booth evaded capture while the largest manhunt in American history pursued him. Booth and Herold hid in tobacco barns and safe houses provided by Confederate sympathizers. They crossed the Potomac River into Virginia seeking refuge in the defeated South. Booth kept a diary during his escape in which he justified his actions and portrayed himself as a patriot. He wrote that he had struck down a tyrant just as Brutus had killed Caesar. Booth believed history would vindicate him and celebrate him as a hero of the South. He could not have been more wrong about how he would be remembered. Federal troops tracked Booth to a tobacco barn on the Garrett Farm near Port Royal, Virginia on April 26, 1865. The barn was surrounded before dawn and the soldiers demanded Booth surrender. Booth refused to give himself up peacefully. He wanted to die fighting rather than face capture and execution. David Herold surrendered, but Booth remained defiant inside the barn. The troops set fire to the barn to force him out into the open. Through the flames and smoke, Sergeant Boston Corbett spotted Booth and fired a single shot. The bullet struck Booth in the neck, severing his spine and paralyzing him. Soldiers dragged the dying assassin from the burning barn onto the porch of the farmhouse. Booth lingered for several hours, unable to move or speak clearly. He asked the soldiers to tell his mother he died for his country. He looked at his hands and whispered his final words, asking them to be lifted up so he could see them. John Wilkes Booth died on the morning of April 26, 1865, 12 days after he murdered Abraham Lincoln. He was 26 years old. His body was secretly buried to prevent his grave from becoming a shrine for Confederate sympathizers. Booth's co-conspirators were captured, tried, and 4 were hanged, including Mary Surratt, the first woman executed by the federal government. The Booth family name, once synonymous with theatrical greatness, became forever associated with infamy and tragedy. Edwin Booth, John Wilkes's older brother and the greatest actor of his generation, was devastated by his brother's crime. He temporarily retired from the stage in shame and grief. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln changed the course of American history and the process of Reconstruction in the South. Many historians believe that Lincoln's death removed the one leader who might have reunited the nation with compassion rather than vengeance. John Wilkes Booth believed he was serving a noble cause and defending Southern civilization. He saw himself as a hero striking down a dictator who had destroyed the Southern way of life. Booth was raised in a border state where loyalties were divided and passions ran deep. His family was split between Union and Confederate sympathies, with his brothers supporting the North while John embraced the South. Booth's father, Junius Brutus Booth, was a famous Shakespearean actor known for his brilliant but erratic performances. The elder Booth struggled with alcoholism and mental instability throughout his life. He named his son after the English radical John Wilkes, a defender of liberty against royal tyranny. The irony of that name would become apparent when John Wilkes Booth himself became a tyrant who murdered a democratically elected president. Young John Wilkes grew up on a farm in Maryland surrounded by the institution of slavery. Though his family did not own many slaves, Booth absorbed the racial attitudes of the South. He believed in white supremacy and the inferiority of African Americans. The thought of freed slaves achieving equality with whites filled him with horror and rage. Booth's acting career began in earnest in 1857 when he joined a theater company in Richmond, Virginia. Richmond would become like a second home to him and the heart of the Confederacy he loved. He performed there regularly and formed deep friendships with Southern sympathizers and Confederate agents. By 1860, Booth was earning substantial money from his performances and was recognized as a major talent. He was especially acclaimed for his athletic stage presence and his ability to perform dangerous stunts. Audiences thrilled to his energetic sword fights and dramatic leaps during performances. Some critics compared him favorably to his more famous brother Edwin, though others found his style too melodramatic. Booth was vain about his appearance and conscious of his effect on women. He had numerous romantic relationships and was engaged at least once, though he never married. Women found him irresistible with his dark curly hair, pale skin, and intense eyes. He used his charm to manipulate people and gain access to places he needed to go. When the Civil War began in April 1861, Booth was performing in Albany, New York. He was one of the few prominent actors who openly supported the Confederacy while working in northern cities. This was dangerous and required him to be careful about how publicly he expressed his views. Booth's decision not to enlist in the Confederate Army has never been fully explained. Some historians suggest he promised his mother he would not fight. Others believe he thought he could serve the South better as a civilian with freedom of movement. Still others think he was simply too fond of his comfortable life as a celebrity to risk it in combat. Whatever the reason, Booth's failure to serve haunted him throughout the war. He felt guilty that other men were fighting and dying while he performed on stage. This guilt may have driven him toward increasingly extreme actions to prove his loyalty to the South. In 1864, Booth began organizing a conspiracy to kidnap President Lincoln and take him to Richmond. The plan was to hold Lincoln hostage and exchange him for Confederate prisoners of war. Booth recruited several co-conspirators including Samuel Arnold, Michael A. Laughlin, John Surratt, David Herold, George Atzerodt, and Lewis Powell. The kidnapping plot went through several iterations but none succeeded. On one occasion in March 1865, Booth and his conspirators waited to ambush Lincoln's carriage, but the president changed his plans at the last moment. The failure of the kidnapping schemes frustrated Booth and pushed him toward more violent thoughts. The fall of Richmond on April 3, 1865 devastated Booth emotionally. He had been in the Confederate capital just weeks before and now it was in Union hands. The Confederacy he loved was collapsing around him and he felt desperate to strike some blow for the cause. When Booth learned that General Lee had surrendered at Appomattox on April 9, he knew the war was effectively over. The South had lost everything and Lincoln's government would now reshape Southern society. Booth could not accept this outcome and decided that killing Lincoln might somehow revive the Confederate cause or at least avenge its defeat. On April 14, Booth learned that Lincoln would attend a performance of the comedy Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater that evening. Booth knew Ford's Theater intimately because he had performed there many times. He knew every hallway, every door, and every exit. He also knew that the theater owner would not question his presence in the building. Booth spent the day making final preparations for the assassination. He met with his co-conspirators and assigned them targets. Lewis Powell was to kill Secretary of State William Seward at his home. George Atzerodt was to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson at his hotel. Booth himself would kill Lincoln at the theater. Only Booth succeeded in his mission that night. Around 10:15 p.m., Booth entered the presidential box at Ford's Theater while the play was in progress. Lincoln's bodyguard had left his post to get a drink at a nearby tavern. Booth barred the door to the box from inside so no one could enter quickly. He approached Lincoln from behind and fired a single shot from his Derringer pistol into the back of the president's head. The bullet entered behind Lincoln's left ear and lodged behind his right eye. Lincoln slumped forward in his chair, mortally wounded. Mary Todd Lincoln screamed as Booth jumped from the box to the stage below. Major Henry Rathbone, who was in the box with the Lincolns, tried to stop Booth but was slashed with a knife. Booth landed awkwardly on the stage and broke the fibular bone in his left leg. Despite the injury, he stood and shouted Sic semper tyrannis, which means thus always to tyrants in Latin. Some witnesses reported he also shouted the South is avenged, though this is disputed. Booth then limped across the stage and out the back door where a horse was waiting. He mounted the horse and rode off into the night, beginning his flight from justice. The audience was initially confused about what had happened. Some thought it was part of the play. But when Mary Todd Lincoln's screams continued and people saw the president's condition, panic erupted in the theater. Doctors in the audience rushed to help Lincoln, but there was nothing they could do. The bullet had caused massive brain damage and Lincoln would never regain consciousness. He was carried across the street to a boarding house where he was laid diagonally across a bed that was too short for his tall frame. Cabinet members, family, and government officials gathered through the night to keep vigil as Lincoln slowly died. Booth meanwhile was riding hard toward Maryland with David Herold. They stopped at Sayat's Tavern to pick up supplies that had been hidden there earlier. Then they continued to the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd, who set Booth's broken leg and provided shelter. Dr. Mudd would later be convicted as a co-conspirator, though he claimed he did not recognize Booth. Booth and Herold hid in the woods for several days while thousands of soldiers searched for them. They were aided by Confederate sympathizers who provided food and shelter. Booth was in constant pain from his broken leg and could not move quickly. He read newspapers and was shocked to discover he was being condemned as a murderer rather than celebrated as a hero. The country was united in grief and outrage over Lincoln's assassination. Even many Southerners who had hated Lincoln condemned Booth's action as dishonorable. Booth had expected to be hailed as a hero but instead found himself reviled as a coward and assassin. His diary entries from this period show his growing desperation and his inability to understand why he was not being praised. Booth and Herold finally crossed the Potomac River into Virginia on April 23 after several failed attempts. They were seeking refuge in the defeated South but found that even there they were not welcome. Most Confederates wanted to put the war behind them and saw Booth as an obstacle to reconciliation. The two fugitives made their way to the Garrett farm near Port Royal, Virginia. They told the Garrett family a false story about being Confederate soldiers heading home. The Garretts allowed them to sleep in their tobacco barn. But the Garretts became suspicious of their guests and locked them in the barn on the night of April 25. Federal troops arrived at the Garrett farm early on the morning of April 26. They had been tracking Booth through informants and clues left along his escape route. The troops surrounded the barn and ordered Booth to surrender. Booth refused and tried to negotiate, asking for time and offering to fight the soldiers one by one. The troops rejected his offers and threatened to burn the barn. David Herold lost his nerve and surrendered, but Booth remained inside. The troops set fire to the barn, and as the flames grew, they could see Booth inside holding a carbine rifle. Sergeant Boston Corbett claimed he fired at Booth because he saw him raising the rifle to shoot. The bullet struck Booth in the neck and he fell to the ground paralyzed. Soldiers dragged him from the burning barn and laid him on the porch of the farmhouse. Booth could not move anything below his neck and had difficulty breathing and speaking. He lingered for about 3 hours as the sun rose on what would be his last day. He asked repeatedly for his hands to be lifted so he could see them. Finally he whispered "useless, useless," and died around 7 in the morning. John Wilkes Booth's body was taken back to Washington and positively identified. He was buried secretly in a warehouse at the Washington Arsenal to prevent his grave from becoming a Confederate shrine. In 1869, his remains were released to his family and reburied in an unmarked grave in Baltimore. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln was a tragedy that affected the entire nation and changed the course of history. Lincoln's vision of a lenient Reconstruction that would heal the nation's wounds died with him. His successor Andrew Johnson lacked Lincoln's political skill and moral authority. The radical Republicans in Congress took control of Reconstruction and imposed harsh measures on the defeated South. This created resentment and resistance that lasted for generations. John Wilkes Booth achieved the opposite of what he intended. Instead of helping the South, he made its recovery more difficult and painful. Instead of being remembered as a hero, he became a symbol of fanaticism and murder. His family name was dishonored and his brother Edwin had to live with the shame of his actions. Booth's story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of extremism and the consequences of political violence. He was a talented man who threw away his gifts and his life for a cause that was already lost. He convinced himself that murder was justified and that history would vindicate him. He was wrong on both counts, and his name will forever be associated with one of the darkest moments in American history.